Jessica Cohen is an independent translator born in England, raised in Israel, and living in Denver. She translates contemporary Hebrew prose and other creative work. In 2017, she shared the Man Booker International Prize with David Grossman for a translation of A Horse Walks into a Bar. She has also translated works by major Israeli writers including Amos Oz, Etgar Keret, Ronit, Matalon, and Arad, and by filmmakers Folman and Nadav, Lapid. She is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Translation and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Cohen works with the Authors Guild and American Literary Translators Association to advocate for literary translators' recognition, rights, and working condition. She spoke about Hebrew literature, the Authors Guild, and working with David Grossman, the famous Israeli author, in this episode. Welcome to Harshniyam, Jessica. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Your father, Professor Stanley Cohen, was a human rights activist. And your mother too, Ruth Cohen, she was an artist. And what kind of impact did your parents have on you as far as your literary sensibilities are concerned?
I'm not sure if it's entirely accurate to describe him as an activist. He was definitely an intellectual. And I think his activism was in the form of writing and thinking and calling things out that he saw. My mother was more of an activist in the sense that she was sort of out on the barricades, protesting and organizing. They both grew up in South Africa and I think developed a sense of the world and of justice or injustice, what they saw growing up under apartheid. And that was something they carried with them very much. And so I think there was a way in which growing up in that household, I think I absorbed this sense of the importance of empathy with people who were not like us or who were less fortunate than us. And that's something they both definitely felt strongly about. And the reason I think that's connected to a literary sensibility is that I think good writing necessitates empathy, both on the part of the writer, definitely, and the reader. That's really, I think, what most good fiction does, is allows you to step into someone else's life, someone who you could never be, but might be through reading. I was born in England, but we moved to Israel when I was 7. And so my schooling was always in Hebrew and my social life was in Hebrew, but everything at home was in English. My parents were both voracious readers. My sister and I also grew up reading a lot. The house was full of books everywhere you looked. And so I definitely, I think, was raised with an appreciation for literature and reading and writing. And that's something I've always had. So I assume that in some ways affected my choice of career, is to live with literature. My dad, when I think of both of them, some of their biggest heroes were writers. Pictures up in my dad's office were Samuel Beckett, George Orwell. My mother had a framed portrait of Virginia Woolf up on her wall. Writers were who they looked to, I think, for inspiration and not just entertainment.
So what made you get into translation? And interestingly, your first customer was Microsoft.
That's true, which is it seems very incongruous with what I do now. Yeah, I think that a lot of people who are my generation and above who are literary translators, we all fell into it by chance or through various other previous lives that we had. That's changing quite a bit now because there are so many more translation programs. And I think younger translators who I meet tend to have more of a conscious decision. I am going to become a literary translator. But for me and many of my peers, that was not the case. I immigrated to the United States right after I finished university. I had studied English literature, had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I really, just by dumb luck, got a job at the Microsoft campus in just near Seattle, where I was living. They needed someone who spoke Hebrew. I didn't know the first thing about computing, about tech. It was 1997, so that was all very big in the Seattle area. But for me, I really didn't know. I had a lot to learn when I was hired there about just basic terms to do with computing. And I was in a group that did Hebrew and Arabic software localization. And so that was the first time that I worked in translation formally as a job. And it was great. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about tech stuff. I learned a lot about working in an office environment. Mostly I learned that I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life. And I did learn quite a bit about translation too. It was mostly tech things and some legal stuff, but I think that was a really good basis for any kind of translation, just the understanding the expectations, the timelines, not just the technicalities of translation, but everything that goes with that. I didn't stay there for very long in that job because my then husband and I moved away. But then I was once again left jobless and directionless, but I liked translation and I thought this is something I could do. And having Microsoft on my resume was a good door opener for me. So I built up a freelance translation business, but still doing all kinds of commercial translation, technical, legal, even medical, mostly those personal documents, some journalism, stuff like that. I worked for a lot of agencies. So that was how I became a translator. And then literary translation was something that I started doing at the time, really as more of a hobby. It was just something that interested me. I was reading a lot of things, literature that came out of Israel by writers who hadn't yet been translated, and thinking, I wish these things were available in English, and I wonder if I could translate them into English. So I didn't really know how to go about it in terms of getting rights, contacting publishers, agents, but I just played around with translating texts. And I had a mentor in Indiana where I was living at the time, Breon Mitchell, who was one of the most renowned translators of German literature. I met him through the university, and he became first a sort of unofficial mentor and then my professor when I went to grad school there. And he was really instrumental in helping me improve as a translator, but also helping me see that I did have the skills to do this and that it was what I wanted to do. And so I very gradually, literary translation started to take over, and I devoted more of my time, more of my energy to it. But I still kept doing commercial translations because that's what pays the bills. And it wasn't for at least a decade or so that I decided to give up the commercial translation and focus just on literary, which in retrospect was a terrible financial decision, but it did make me a lot happier.
Okay, that's nice. Now, Brian Michel, about his mentorship. What is the best takeaway from that mentorship?
One of the takeaways, which I've been thinking about now because I'm starting to dip my toe into a little bit of teaching, and I've been doing quite a lot of mentoring over the time, but I'm planning to teach a workshop. So one of the most interesting things that I think is surprising to people who haven't done this is how helpful someone can be when they do not speak your source language. Breon, as I said, translates from German. He does speak some other languages, but not a word of Hebrew. And so at first I thought, how is this going to work? What could he possibly have to say? But in fact, what I realized through working with him is that the key thing is how your translations sound in the target language, in English in my case. And so he and I would, initially our work together consisted of meeting for coffee or lunch. I would send him a short story or whatever I'd been translating, and he would give it back to me with just very bare bones comments. Things would just be underlined. There'd be little points here and there. And he wouldn't necessarily say, I think this is a problem because ABC, here's how you need to solve it. He would just mark things that stood out for him, that stopped him. And then I would know, okay, there's something here that needs work. And very often, and this is still the case when I get back edited work, the things that are marked are the exact things that I knew were a problem, that I struggled with during the translation. And they come back and indeed they need more work because I wasn't quite there. And so I suppose what he taught me was, how absolutely crucial it is that your translations read as a work of literature in the language that you're translating into, and that you should trust your gut. And if you know something isn't quite working, you need to keep going with it until you find a solution. And that solution may be quite far away from the original, which is, I think that the more I have worked as a translator, the further my translations get from the original. But that's not something you can do when you're starting off because you just don't have the confidence. And so it took me a while to gain that. But that is something I think he was trying to show me early on.
Now, you lived in Israel for, I think, a couple of decades, if I'm correct, 17 years. So how much of living there, help you in translating Hebrew?
A lot. A lot of translators are not purely bilingual in the sense that usually their source language is one they've acquired later in life, either through living somewhere or learning or a combination of both. There are a handful of strictly bilingual translators, and it's certainly not a prerequisite. But for me personally, control of my fluency in Hebrew is a big part of why I'm able to do what I do and do it. I often read and hear translators talking about their approach to translation and why and how they're doing it. And they speak of carrying something out of a less familiar environment into their familiar native linguistic and cultural environment. And for me, it's really much more of a two-way street. I feel as comfortable in Hebrew and in Israel as I do here in an English-speaking country. Not in terms of writing. My writing in Hebrew, although I'm entirely capable of writing, I don't write all that. I could not write literary stuff in Hebrew. I've tried and failed. So for me, having a more or less equal facility and comfort with the language is what I think makes me a translator, or at least the kind of translator that I am. Yeah, I can't really imagine translating out of a language that I don't feel as at home in as I do in Hebrew. So having grown up there, spent most of my childhood, all of my adolescence and my very young adulthood, which I think are very formative years, of course it does happen that there's a cultural reference I may not be sure of or not pick up on. But for the most part, it's pretty rare that I really have no idea what something is referring to or what it means. The difficulty is finding out or figuring out how to say it in English, but it's not often happened to me that I will miscomprehend the original. Sometimes I may need to get more context or ask the author about it. But yeah, I feel very familiar with most of the originals that I'm reading and working from.
Now, Hebrew is spoken in many countries in Europe, European continent, and of course in the United States. And I presume there will be some difference in dialect and accent too. So what are the major challenges that you face when translating Hebrew into English?
It's true that Hebrew is spoken in many countries in the world. In fact, I think it would be difficult to find a country where there isn't an Israeli at some given time.
Even in India we have, yes.
Oh yeah, lots and lots of Israelis travel in India, and some of them end up staying there for quite a while. So there's little expat communities really all over the world. Obviously in the United States, in England, in Germany, which I think is a sort of irony of history. There's a massive population of Israeli expats. But there aren't really dialects of modern Hebrew. Even within Israel, there are some slight variations mostly based on class, I would say, not so much region. There used to be more differences in different types of Hebrew in the sort of early years of the state and into the 50s and 60s. There were quite pronounced differences between the way Jews from North African and Middle Eastern countries spoke Hebrew and Eastern European Jews, the different pronunciations of certain letters. And those sort of faded over the decades and melded into this one Israeli Hebrew. So that at this point, it's quite unusual to hear really sharp differences in accent or pronunciation. So there are differences, I would say, in register, intonation, a little bit of an accent difference, but not much. So that's not necessarily something that presents a challenge in Hebrew the way I know it does for some languages that have real distinct dialects. So the challenges, there are many. I would say probably the two main ones from Hebrew for me, as I mentioned before, register. So register and I suppose context. So because ancient Hebrew is one of the oldest languages in the world, and it is very much the basis for modern Hebrew, you have this really interesting and quite extreme mixture of different sources of Hebrew and different registers. So within the same sentence, you might find a biblical phrase and a very current sort of street, almost slangy phrase within one dialogue line. And it doesn't stand out to Hebrew readers as anything bizarre, or it wouldn't stop them in their tracks. But when I try to convey that in English, it's really hard to find a way to do that without sounding just ridiculous, because there's such a stark difference between those two worlds. It would almost be like combining Shakespearean English with modern New York slang, right? It would just sound so incongruous. But that is so equivalent to what is quite often done in Hebrew. And so that's something I struggle with, is to try and find an English equivalent to this blend of different types of Hebrew, different historical layers of Hebrew, and without sounding too odd.
What's your solution for that?
I think I'm going to end up saying this often in this interview. It's very hard for me to formulate solutions or even rules of thumb. I feel very strongly that each case presents its own sets of problems and therefore has its own solution depending on the context, on whether it's dialogue versus narrative, on what sort of book it is, who's going to be reading it, what knowledge can I assume. I know this is not very helpful for beginning translators to hear that there is no solution, but it's something that over time and with experience and I suppose an instinct you find. And sometimes I don't find the right solution. It can be very frustrating. But I try to remind myself that the only people who would know that I didn't really solve the problem are the people who also read the original. But there aren't that many people who are doing that, right? Reading side by side. So often the losses are ones that not many people are aware of. But I would say the other general sort of type of challenge that I come across a lot when going from Hebrew to English, and again, this has to do with Hebrew being an ancient language and English being newer, although not new, is that Hebrew compared to English has a tiny vocabulary. But very often a Hebrew word will carry many layers of meaning. So I like to think of Hebrew as a depth language, whereas English is more of a breadth language. So one of the things I love about English is the almost infinite possibilities of how to say something, right? You look in English thesaurus, it's just fantastic. And you know that you're going to find the perfect word to say what you mean. But in Hebrew, although the vocabulary is limited, one word can convey so many allusions and so much context that it's impossible to get across in any other language. And that can be really frustrating. And often it just means that I have to pick. And sometimes I'll do that in collaboration with the author. This word or this term is conveying these 3 or 4 different worlds of meaning. Which one of them is more important? Because I'm going to have to lose out on some of them. So that's a big challenge.
So how often you contact authors regarding this?
I always have some communication with authors, and it really varies a lot depending on usually on the author's interest or availability, or often an author just has moved on. They're deep in another project. They don't necessarily want to or feel they can delve back into something they may have written years ago. But they're always available to me. And yeah, again, it depends on kind of the relationship that evolves between us. Some authors have become really close friends of mine, and then we do speak quite a lot about the work, and they will offer solutions. It also depends on how good their English is. Most Israelis speak pretty good English, in some cases very good. Sometimes their English is just not good enough to necessarily comment on the translation or offer solutions. So yeah, it really depends on the specific case. But I always have some contact, and at the very least, I will pretty much always have a list of queries that I'll send at some point. And either I'll just get back straight responses, or it'll open more of a dialogue that can be ongoing.
On the day one when you started literary translation and now, what kind of effect literary translation had on your English?
I think that it's affected my sense of what I'm doing, which is I would now describe myself as an author or a writer, let's say. When I started off, I wouldn't have. In fact, I was just on I forget where I came across this. I was online searching for something to do with translation, and I came across this Reddit thread and to do with translators' compensation or something. And someone said, translation isn't writing. It's just a work for hire, and there's no reason why translators should get royalties or anything like that. And I was really outraged because to me, and I think to every translator, every literary translator, it goes without saying that we are writers, and you cannot be a good translator without being a writer. That is what we're doing. So I'm not doing the sort of heavy lifting of writing and coming up with a story and developing characters and plots and all of that, which I don't actually have the interest or I think the skills to do. But I get to take all that work that someone else has done, do the actual work of writing, of playing with language and moving words around and sentences, which is what I love. I think going in, especially because I started off with non-literary translation, I had a different view of what I was doing. It felt more transactional. I take this text and then I put it in this other language and then I send it in and I'm done. And now I really, as a literary translator, I really feel that I am putting a lot more of myself into the work. I live with them. I really do feel quite a lot of ownership over my work. And without a doubt, my writing has become better in English because it's what I do all day. And usually the more you do something, the better you get at it.
Now, you translated a lot of non-fiction too. So, if you had to advise the translators who are starting out, what should be the difference in approach when it comes to fiction and fiction versus non-fiction? Any key parameters to look at?
This is another thing that I find difficult to articulate exactly how it's different, but it does feel as though there's a slightly different part of my brain working when I'm doing fiction versus nonfiction. Of course, it depends on what, because some nonfiction can be very literary and very creative, but on the whole, for one thing, I do stay closer to the original when it's nonfiction. Everything that I was just saying about making the text my own and departing is less true for nonfiction. I might take quite a bit of liberties in terms of how a sentence or a paragraph or even a chapter is structured to make it work better in English. But as a rule, I'd be sticking much more closely and I would be keeping the Hebrew, the original, open as I'm working all the time. When I'm translating fiction, and this is probably not something my authors would be very happy to hear, but once I do the first draft, I don't really look at the original very much because the original was my raw material. And after my first draft is done, that's it. I'm working with what I have. Of course, I do go back whenever there's any question or doubt or I want to verify something. But really, the original's work is done once I've done my first draft. And that's very much not the case with nonfiction because it's just a lot more important to be sure I'm accurately conveying any factual things, any arguments, any data, things like that. So I think that is probably the main difference. But even with nonfiction, there is some creativity. You're still playing with language and finding the best way to say something. So it might be a slightly different set of sort of brain muscles that you're employing, but you're still employing them.
Now I'll come to my favorite part, the BCLT lecture. Probably the best 59 minutes I heard anybody speaking about translation ever. That is the reluctant editor translating the unstable originals. Can you take us through that lecture?
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you for saying such nice things about it. I gave a slightly different version of that talk actually at Princeton. When I say online, but for Princeton's series of translator talks. It was, I think, about 3 years ago, somewhere deep in the pandemic. So that was the basis for the BCLT lecture. And the way that the idea for the talk evolved for me was both from the way that I saw my own work changing, the types of projects that I was getting. So the lecture, just to give a very brief synopsis, is about translation as a form of editing of the original. And the way that so many original works, at least in my work, are not necessarily just the final printed book that comes to me and sits on my desk or let's say in the form of a PDF, and that's what I'm translating, end of story. Those are at this point the anomaly in my work. Often a book that I'm going to translate will be shortened before I start translating it. So there's quite a significant expansion rate when going from Hebrew to English, 30%, sometimes even 35% or more, which means that a reasonable length book in Hebrew will start to be not so reasonable in English. And very often, if it's an author who has not yet been published in English and we're going to be going out and pitching and trying to find a publisher, the length can be a deterrent. It's harder to sell a 500 or 600 or 700 page novel than a 400 or 500. So sometimes that's the reason for shortening it before I even start working. And I've had that done in quite a few cases, and it'll be done either by the author themselves or by an editor that we hire, or various permutations of that. And then there are also, beyond just shortening for length, that once you open the window for that, you start to get into the idea that, are there things in this book that are going to be so difficult to convey to an English reading audience and will lose so much meaning that perhaps they need to be changed or taken out? And that's a very tricky thing, which is one of the things I was talking about in my lecture, because there's really almost an ethical question here of how much can you change a book and still call it the same book? And again, there's no real rule here. And one of the reasons why I don't like to do that sort of editing myself, either before I translate or as I go, is precisely because the temptation, even in some sort of unconscious way, there would be a temptation to make my work easier by cutting out things that are very difficult to translate. I don't want to do that. I don't think I should be doing that. So all of that I just felt like those sort of projects where there's this elasticity of the original text were becoming more and more common in my work. And then round about that same time, I read Karen Emmerich's book, which is called Literary Translation and the Making of Originals. And she's looking at some case studies. She translates from Greek, modern Greek. And she was looking at a few books where this quote unquote original didn't really exist as such, or at least there was not one definitive original. And she, as the translator, and in some cases along with an editor and a publisher, author, various other people who were in the orbit of the book, would have to fish out a version that she was going to work from among various permutations of the original, different versions of the manuscript. Each book, I think many books have this sort of their own biography, all the sort of incarnations that they go through. And so reading her book, I think, was a way for me to articulate some of these ideas that I'd had in my head in a sort of vague, unformulated way. And that's when I started writing the lecture that you saw at the BCLT. And I think it was one of those talks where I asked questions more than answered them. But for me, those are the most interesting things to read and to hear, is the questions, not necessarily the answers. And a lot of, in addition to the books that I've had, which are similar to the cases that Karen looks at, where there's all these different versions floating around, I also translate quite a lot, and this also relates to your previous question about nonfiction. I translate a lot of op-eds, essays, short nonfiction pieces that are not necessarily ever published in Hebrew, or at least they have not been before I start translating them. For example, for the past, coming up on 3 years, I've been translating a Substack newsletter for Etgar Keret, who is a very well-known Israeli writer. He writes short stories, sometimes called flash fiction, and he's been hugely successful really all over the world, in English, but also in many European languages. In South America, he's very popular, and he's a great author. And he started publishing this Substack newsletter, which is occasionally short stories, but more often it's nonfiction pieces, little personal essays, his thoughts about writing. Increasingly in the last 6 months or so, it's about current affairs and things going on around him. And these are pieces that in many cases are written for the newsletter, which is going to be in English. He writes them in Hebrew, he sends them to me. And so they're not finalized by any means when he sends them. And our process of working is that I'll do a draft of the translation, send it back to him. He might make changes based on that. And there's quite a bit of back and forth. And often he will end up publishing the Hebrew, say, in an Israeli newspaper, or actually we're currently working on a book that's going to be coming out of short stories, many of which were taken from our work on stories for the newsletter and for some other outlets. So he's almost finalizing the originals based on what happened during the translation instead of the other way around. So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this interplay between original and translation and seeing that it's not necessarily a one-way street, and there can be like a reverse influence from the translation onto the original.
No, I gather that sometimes even translators make some corrections in the original. It so happens that,
Oh,
yeah.
yes. Yeah, for sure. In fact, I was just talking about this with someone about translators. I think most authors who've had this experience will know that translators are the best fact checkers. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had an author say that they're simply astounded that a book had gone through multiple editors, proofreaders, copy editors, all the process that it should go through before it comes out. And then I'll find a mistake, either a continuity error sometimes or some other little mistake. I've never found anything glaring, but definitely little mistakes that they get very frustrated when they realize that was in the original. And every translator I know has found mistakes or things that should be corrected in the original.
Before we get on to your work, please tell us about Authors Guild, which you are part of.
Yeah, so the Authors Guild is an American or US based organization that was founded originally for authors. In the United States, we don't have unions. We don't have unionizing is very much more difficult than in some other countries. And so the Authors Guild is the closest thing there is to a union for writers, journalists, there are other people who work in publishing who are there. And several years ago, my colleague and friend Alex Zucker, who translates from Czech, he's always been very involved in trying to push for translators' rights and advocating and more of a professionalization. He established contact with the guilds and came up with the idea of trying to set up a translators group or presence within the organization. And so he and I and Julia Sanchez, who's also a great translator who works with us, and some other colleagues, have been working with the Guild for a few years now. So there are two main projects that we've done with them. One is to have a survey of literary translators, and we've done two of those. One was in 2017 and the other was done last year, where we really wanted to get some actual data about how translators, or I should say, if translators are making a living in the United States, literary translators. The very short answer is no. Literary translation is simply not a viable way to make a living as a sole source of income. There are very few exceptions to that. But we drilled down into quite some detail about what rates translators were getting and also contractual issues. Are translators getting royalties? Are they getting their name on the cover? Are they getting the opportunity to review proofs and changes that are made to their work? All sorts of things that we feel are essential contract terms that a lot of translators simply either aren't aware of or they ask for and are denied by publishers. It's a slow kind of campaign that we're trying to keep moving to make translators more aware and to have more of a conversation with publishers about their need to be aware of these issues too. And so the other main project that we did with the Guild, with the legal staff who are really great, one of the things that the Authors Guild offers to members is contract review, but they did not have that available specifically for translation contracts. They offered it to their author members. And there are different issues that one needs to be aware of in a translation contract. So we worked together with their legal staff to write a model translation contract for literary translation that's accompanied by very extensive commentary explaining the different terms and the different options and why one might want to get certain terms and how things should be phrased. So that's available as a resource for anyone. You don't have to be a member of the Guild to work with that. So it's been an uphill battle, partly because we are a very small constituent within the Guild. There just aren't that many active literary translators who joined the Guild and who can agitate for our rights. But we're trying to continue to work with them and also with ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association, which is a long-time organization for literary translators in the States. And they're fantastic and offer a lot of support and networking, and they have a great conference every year. They don't really have the resources to do some of the legal and advocacy work that we've been trying to do, but I think that might be changing a bit.
Do you think situation in UK is any better for literary translators comparatively?
I think that it is on the whole. Even though I was born in England, I have not lived there since I was a child. So I go back quite a lot, and I belong to the Translators Association in England. So I have a bit of an outside view of what's going on. But my impression is that, yes, generally speaking, look, I think part of it has to do with the fact that readers in England are more interested in reading literature in translation than American readers are. The American cultural and literary world is quite insular and not outward looking. Americans do not, as a whole, feel much of an interest in knowing what's going on in the rest of the world. And that's reflected in politics and in cultural consumption. And England, Brexit notwithstanding, is much more of I think British people feel that they are part of a larger world, whether it's Europe or beyond. And so they consume more literature in translation, and therefore translators are, I'm not going to say they're better remunerated, because I don't think they do necessarily make more if you're looking at actual pay, but I think there's a little bit more of an appreciation of what they do and the importance of it. And so that gives them, I think, a bit of a leg up as compared to American translators. It's a much smaller country too, so they have just technically speaking, it's easier for them to meet in person, to have organizations like the TA that can offer events. We have the equivalent here, which is Alta, which I mentioned, do a lot of things, but we're in this enormous country. So I feel, as someone, I live in Denver, Colorado, which is not really in the middle of anything. And I know that if I were in New York or perhaps San Francisco, Chicago, I would have a lot more opportunities to meet other translators, to go to literary events, readings. There's just so much going on in those places. And England, yes, granted, most of it is happening in London. But first of all, people from the rest of England can get to London much, more frequently and cheaply than I can get to New York. So those circumstances, I think, yeah, it makes more of a community and camaraderie, and people talk and know what's going on and what everyone else is working on. And that does make a difference.
What are you currently working on, Jessica?
So I actually just this week finished first draft of a book by Maya Arad. I translated another book of hers that just came out and is currently getting quite a lot of press. It's called The Hebrew Teacher, the one that came out. So Maya has actually been a great personal friend of mine for many years, and I have been trying to find a publisher for her in English for many years, and have translated short things of hers here and there and done some pitches and published a couple of excerpts, short stories. But The Hebrew Teacher is the first time she has a book out in English. And the same publisher, New Vessel Press, which published The Hebrew Teacher, already bought the rights to her most recent book, which is going to be called Happy New Years in English. So that's my current project. In plural, yes. It's not quite a literal translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew title, which is Shanim Tovot, which literally translates as good years, but it's a reference to the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, on which traditionally people used to send each other or give each other special greeting cards for the New Year. And those were known as Shanim Tovot, good years, which wasn't quite working in English to convey that. So we went with Happy New Year's because it refers to this greeting of have a Happy New Year. And that's what I'm working on now.
Other author is David Grossman, whom you translated, I think, quite extensively. And even you won the Man Booker International Prize 2017. Tell us about his work and any interesting experience you had with him while translating.
David Grossman has been a huge part of my career. And when I first started really trying to break into literary translation, after I realized that this was something I wanted to do, I contacted David Grossman's agent, Deborah Harris, who represents many of Israel's greatest writers. She's based in Jerusalem. And I got in touch with her through a mutual friend. And she gave me my first book to translate, which was by Ronit Matalon, who was a really amazing Israeli writer who sadly died at a very young age a few years ago. And then the second book I did for her was for David Grossman. He'd had a series of different translators for his previous few books, and he was looking for someone new. And they gave me a try, and I think I did a sample. And based on that, they gave me the book, which in retrospect was a huge leap of faith on their part, David and his agent, because I wasn't very experienced. But I did that book. It was a book of 2 novellas, and I've translated all his work since. And it's really been, as I said, the defining relationship, I think, of my career, because I have translated so many of his books. I've done 6, if I'm not mistaken, mostly fiction, but also some nonfiction and the occasional essay, op-ed, lecture, all kinds of things that he writes, a couple of children's books as well. Grossman has, within Israel, he has this status of sort of one of the elder statesmen of literature. And up until recently, there were 3, I would say, who occupied this position and was sometimes referred to as the trio. 2 of them, Amos Oz and Ebi Yoshua, have died in the last few years. And Grossman is the last man standing of that. He's actually a bit younger than those 2, but, absolute main figures of Hebrew literature. And with good reason. And I think there's a tendency to view him cynically. I think a lot of Israelis sort of love to hate him. Well, not hate him, but I think they poke fun sometimes at this very serious role that he's stepped into, where he's often described as the moral compass of Israeli society. And that is not a role that he ever asked for or sought out, I think. But I think he fills it very admirably. And he is, having spent quite a lot of time with him, both one-on-one and with a group of translators, and I can talk about that in a minute, he really is a very inspirational person. And I know that sounds, as we say in America, cheesy. And I don't often use that word, but it's true. There is, I think every so often you come across someone who does really, there's a sense of thoughtfulness about him, seriousness, but he also has a great sense of humor. And I don't think he takes himself too seriously. And above all, and what's most pertinent to this conversation, is he's a great writer. And he is a very careful and meticulous writer. He pays so much attention to the way he crafts every single sentence. I know that when I ask him a question, he will always have an answer. He will always be able to tell me why this word and not another, why this comma is here. And that's not the case with all writers I work with. Sometimes I think a lot of Israeli writers have really fantastic ideas and a drive and a source material, but they don't necessarily have the sitzfleisch to really create a very crafted, thought out text, which they go over and over and over again. Israelis are not necessarily, and I say this not with criticism, but with love, because I count myself as an Israeli, but they're not known for perfectionism. I think there are social and political reasons why most things that are done in Israel are done in a way that's good enough, and then you move on to the next thing. And that doesn't really work for good writing. So Grossman is someone who really, and he's known for this, he writes many drafts. And when I say drafts, he starts each draft from scratch. The first one being handwritten. I think he still does that. And you could tell the care that goes in. And so it's, as every translator knows, it's a pleasure to translate something that's well written, which is not to say it isn't difficult or challenging, but I think that when you have a sense of how much care and attention the writer has put in, it motivates you to put an equal amount of care and attention. One of the most amazing experiences I've had through my work with Grossman is that for the last 3 books that he's published, he has convened a seminar over several days of his translators. Not all of them. He's translated into, I think, over 40 languages. But in each of these 3, there have been, I think, anywhere between 8 and a dozen or so translators, all working on the same book into their respective languages. I was not able to be at the very first one because I had just given birth. So I attended parts of it virtually over Zoom. But for the past 2, I have been there in person. One was in Germany at a literary translation center and residency in Strahlen in Germany. And the last one was in Croatia because there was a thematic and topical connection to the book we were working on, parts of which take place in Croatia. And so what happens there is that over the course of 4 or 5 days, we, as a group with Grossman, sit in a seminar room and we go over the entire book. And the basis is that he will read us the book. He'll just start from the beginning reading through the whole book. And whenever there's something that he wants to emphasize or explain or discuss, he will stop and we'll have a discussion. When one of us has a question, we'll stop him. And it really evolves into just really interesting conversations about the themes and ideas that come out of the book, about language, about the different ways that we as translators approach and solve the different issues. I think it's also been really interesting for him, and he's talked about how it's, I think, affected the way he looks at writing and language to hear our experiences bringing his words into our languages. It's also created a really great little, small, pretty tight-knit group of translators who work with him, because many of us have met several times now in these seminars and also in a couple of other events around authors that we translate together. And it's been very helpful, sometimes practically, even though we translate into different languages, there's still ways we can help each other practically, but mostly in just, yes, feeling this sort of fraternity of translators that I think is one of the great things about this job. And having this access to the author is very unusual over such an extended period of time. There's also something, and I found this in particular with A Horse Walks into a Bar, hearing him read. David Grossman started off as a radio announcer. Radio plays, he used to read the news. He has a very radiophonic voice. And so hearing him read his own work and personify the characters, especially for those of your listeners who have read A Horse Walks into a Bar, there's the main character is a stand-up comedian. He's this really interesting voice. And to hear David reading this was just fascinating and really helpful for the translation, because often hearing the way something is enunciated, the intonation, can change the way you interpret a text. So it has been very helpful. And I know that he's planning to keep doing these, I think, whenever he can for all his books, because it is such a helpful experience. And I think it also saves him some time and effort, where instead of corresponding with multiple translators separately, often about the same issues, he gets to do it all at once and get us all on the same page, as it were.
So when you say seminar, it pertains to one particular book, is it? You focus on one particular book and meet all the translators.
Yeah. Yes. So it's around one book, and that means that all the translators will be at different points of their work. In some cases, there might be one or two translators there who haven't even started working. They will have just read the book. Some have only done a first draft. Some have already submitted the final draft, but they get to come and take part in this as a perk. But most of us will be at some different point along the second or third draft, say. And yeah, but all working from the same book.
That sounds wonderful, actually. Tell us about this New Vessels Press now, the indie, I guess they're indie publishers too.
They're based in New York, founded by Michael Weiss, and there was a co-founder as well who I think is less involved. It's not quite a one-man show, but almost. Michael, he was a journalist for a very long time. He's been in the sort of literary and cultural world for decades. And yeah, he started this publisher that publishes almost exclusively translations from many different languages. He has done quite a few books from Hebrew. I've published 4 translations with him, and I'm currently working on my 5th. My Arad, as I mentioned, is who he publishes. And he's really, I would say, an old school publisher in that he's very committed to sticking with his authors and building relationships with them. And he's not just looking for a hit. He's a small indie publisher, so he struggles like all small indie publishers do. And of course, I'm sure he's thrilled when something sells really well and can subsidize the rest of his books. But I think he knows that the chances of that are not likely. So he's looking for really good quality literature. And it is important to him that it come from elsewhere in the world. And I think he, like many of us who are in this business in the States, really think that it's important to expose American readers to other cultures, other languages. Because when you think about it, it obviously cannot be true that the only good literature is being written in English, even though some readers here seem to behave that way. Yeah, so New Vessel has done some really interesting work, mostly fiction from European and other languages. The 4 that have come out, and the 5th that's going to come out, I think, next summer, a little over a year from now.
Now, I have picked up 2 books which are recently released for you to introduce them to our listeners. The first one is Professor Schiff's Guilt. Interestingly, the author is also Schiff, right?
Absolutely. Agur has been a good friend of mine for a really long time. I did meet him through literature, and I translated a couple of short stories of his that actually came out many years ago. One came out in Two Lines, which was one of the first literary journals in the United States that devoted to translation. And I published little pieces of his work over the years, but New Vessel Press was his first publisher of a book in English. And it is, as you said, it's called Professor Schiff's Guilt. And so the main character is an alter ego of Agur, of the writers. And it's a really interesting book. Writes, not everything he's written, but quite a lot of what he writes is political satire, which you would think would be a very common genre in Israel, and it's not. I'm not quite sure why, because there's plenty to satirize there, but for some reason, form of fiction, it's not all that common. And he does it excellently. He has a great sense of humor. He's very sharp. I would say that he is not politically correct, and proudly, which has meant, unfortunately, that he hasn't done all that well in the States with this book, and which I'm really disappointed by, because I think people are uncomfortable with being shown some of the truths that he is showing about Western hypocrisies and misunderstandings. He's not afraid to poke fun, firstly at himself. Part of the reason why the main character is named after him, and the main character is not a particularly, the portrayal is not so flattering. Obviously, it's not really him, but he is pointing out, I think, some of his own blind spots and hypocrisies. But it's a great novel. It's interesting. It's funny, and I hope more people read it.
When you say satire, don't you feel it's a bit challenging to translate?
It is. Humor is difficult. Satire is difficult. Yeah, because, of course, if you're not familiar with the person or the event or the reference that's been satirized, you're not going to get it. It loses meaning. So it can be really difficult, yeah. And sometimes it requires a bit more sneaking in some explication so that people understand the references. But yeah, I think it can be done, but it's definitely a challenge. Like most forms of humor, they're so culturally dependent that they don't necessarily carry over well.
Now, the other one is The Hebrew Teacher, written by Maya Arad. Tell us about Maya Arad, the author. I think this is the second book that you are translating, The Hebrew Teacher, or is the first one, The Hebrew Teacher?
So The Hebrew Teacher is the first full book of hers that I translated, and I'm currently working on another one. She's one of Israel's most successful writers, both critically and commercially. I think almost every single one of her books has been a bestseller in Israel. She's very well known.
Now, The Hebrew Teacher, it consists of 3 novellas.
Yeah, so The Hebrew Teacher has 3 novellas. The first one is the title novella. It's called The Hebrew Teacher, and it is about, the main character is an Israeli woman who left Israel in the 60s, came to the Midwest, to an unnamed Midwestern university in a sort of college town is where it takes place, and she teaches Hebrew and has been doing so. She's not an academic. She's not a professor. She's an adjunct or something like that. So lowly status within academia. And she is a dedicated and warm and caring teacher who loves her students and feels very committed to the idea of exposing students to Hebrew and to Israeli culture. And even though she hasn't lived in Israel for decades, she still feels this great sense of pride and love for Israel. And she's out of touch with the times and is confronted. The main story in this novella is that a young new professor of comparative literature who's originally Israeli comes to teach on the campus, and he just destabilizes the whole program and confronts her with the opinions of the younger generation now, which is much, much more critical of Israel. And she knows this to be true and understands the reasons why, but she's not at peace with it. And so these 2 professors represent the different extremes of the arc now of how Americans or American Israelis or American Jews look at Israel. And she's on her way down and he's on his way up is the setup. So that's the intergenerational conflict there. And then the other two novellas, the middle one is about an Israeli grandmother who comes to California to visit her son who's lived there for many years, and his young wife and their small child who she's never met, her own grandson who she hasn't seen yet. And this is a story that I think probably rings true for a lot of immigrant cultures, not necessarily Israelis. It's this experience of the younger generation who's moved to America and left the parents, the grandparents back home, and they come to visit. And so there's a culture clash, there's a generation clash, there's this just, I think, pretty universal experience of kids, young adults whose parents come to stay with them. And you have this presence in your house of someone who you love and you want to see them and they're your parents, but it's also a pain in the neck to have them breathing down your neck, looking very closely at how you live your life. And so that's what's going on in this story, is her kind of scrutinizing their lifestyle and trying to figure out the cultural codes that she doesn't pick up on and why they do things the way they do. And they have some tension in their marriage too, which she wasn't aware of and is trying to understand. That's that story. And then the last one is, again, I think pretty universal. And it's about a mother whose sort of preteen daughter is going through all the social drama that any middle schooler goes through. And how to navigate friendships and mean girls and this struggle for status at school and people talking behind each other's backs, all that stuff that every adolescent goes through. And again, they're a family of Israeli expats. The parents are Israeli expats. The kids grew up in America. So there's that cultural issue as well and the language issue. And a lot of it deals with these sort of challenges and threats of technology. Phones, social media, what that is doing to that generation, how the parents are supposed to navigate it, the fears that we all have of what our children are being exposed to. This is something that I'm personally very much relate to right now because I'm about to get my daughter her first phone. And there's all this fear of this horrible world that is going to open up to her. But it's a world that is the world. We cannot escape it.
Please read a paragraph from the book, both in Hebrew and in English.
So I chose to read a paragraph that I know this is perhaps sounds like a strange choice, but it's from almost the very end of the book. But it's not a spoiler. There isn't really any spoiler here. And it's from the last novella that I just mentioned about the mother and her daughter and the reason I chose this is that one of the things that I think is not often pointed out about Maya Arad's writing, but to me is one of the most interesting things, is the way she writes about friendship, particularly between women. And I've seen quite a lot written about that. Just in the last couple of years, it seems to have become a theme that people are exploring in literature and in writing. And I think probably Elena Ferrante has given rise to that because that's the seminal book about female friendship. And so in this novella, the mother is so desperate to make sure that her child is socially accepted and that she has friends, and she tries to help her navigate that, but without getting too involved. But really, the whole time, as it turns out at the end, she's realizing her own struggles with friendship and her relationship with other women. And so that's what this paragraph is about. And this is after all kinds of drama has unfolded. And she goes out for a walk to try and clear her head and think over everything that's happened. So I'll read the Hebrew first. מולה חולפות משפחות צעירות עם ילדים, זוגות מבוגרים ממנה, חבורות של נשים בגילה. 4 אמהות מבית הספר של יותם מחייכות אליה. היא לא היחידה שצועדת לבדה, ובכל זאת היא נבוכה. להסתובב כאן לבד, בשבת בצהריים, זה קצת כמו ללכת לחוגים בבית הספר של ליבי. להודות שאתה לא שייך לשום חבורה, שאין לך עם מי לשבת בהפסקה. אין לה עם מי לשבת, אפרת מבינה פתאום. יש לה קולגות, יש אנשים שהיא מכירה דרך העבודה של בני, נשים שהיו להם ילדים בגילים דומים, ועכשיו, אחרי שהילדים גדלו, הכל ניתק. בעצם, היא מבינה עכשיו, שום דבר לא השתנה מאז שהייתה ילדה. היא לא יודעת איך ליצור חברויות, איך להיות חברה. היא מצאה בן זוג, להקים איתו משפחה, קשרה בריתות שסייעו לה לעבור את השירות הצבאי, את הלימודים באוניברסיטה, את גידול הילדים, אבל חברות ממש, לא נערות ללמוד איתם למבחן, אמהות להעביר איתם זמן בגינה, הדבר עצמו, זה לא היה לה מעולם. עכשיו מאוחר מדי, היא לא יכולה להתחיל. and in English. So she's out on this mountaintop thinking back about her daughter, whose name is Libby, who told her how much she struggles to find friends. And something that her daughter said to her was that if you join, the mother had suggested that her daughter Libby join some clubs at school to make friends. And Libby said, no, none of the cool kids join clubs. If you join a club, that means you don't have real friends. So she's thinking back on that. She passes young families with kids, older couples, groups of women her age. 4 mothers from your town's school smile at her. She's not the only one walking alone, but she still feels awkward. Walking around here alone on a Saturday afternoon is a little like going to Libby's school clubs, an admission that you don't belong to a group, that you have no one to sit with at recess. She has no one to sit with, Efrat suddenly thinks. She has no friends. She has her colleagues, people she knows through Benny's work, women with kids around her kids' ages. But now that the children are older, those ties have been cut. In fact, she understands now, nothing has changed since she was a child. She doesn't know how to forge friendships, how to be a friend. She found a spouse and built a family with him. She formed alliances that helped her get through her military service, college, raising kids. But friends, real friends, not girls to study for a test with or mums to kill time at the playground with. Friendship itself. She's never had that. And it's too late now. She can't start at this age.
At a deeply personal level, what does literary translation mean to you?
This is something I think about a lot. And of course, these are only things that I've understood pretty recently. In the last few years, these are not in any way conscious thoughts that I had at the time. But in retrospect, I understand that translation for me has always been a way to, I want to say reconcile, but it's not quite as peaceful as that, to negotiate the two halves of my identity, which are Hebrew speaking and English speaking. In some ways, I consider myself tricultural because I am both English and American, but also definitely Israeli. And the reason I reconcile is not the right word is because I know that this is a futile attempt, but it's an attempt that I make through my work and will continue to make for as long as I do it. And it's always going to be futile, right? I think every person who is an immigrant or is in some way bicultural knows that this can never really be resolved. It's something you learn to live with. And living in Hebrew literature and English literature that I'm producing at the same time is a way for me to keep this dialogue going that is going on in my mind all the time anyway. But I suppose it's a way to externalize it and to put in writing this constant struggle that I have to make sense of how two such very different cultures can coexist in my mind. The term coexistence is thrown around a lot in the Middle East because there's such a lack of it. And as an individual, I can say that it is very difficult. And in some ways, as I said, this is not something that's ever going to be reconciled. But translation is by definition multidimensional and many layered. Right? It's a recognition that there is no one voice that is right. And you have to be able to accept and express this plurality, these different nuances that come from different cultures. And so that, I think, is why I do it and how I do it.
Wonderful, wonderful, lads. Thank you. Thank you for such a lovely conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk through these things.